it's my pleasure to be here today. Pretty exciting to be able to work with NWSI again and do another presentation. This one's on Leave No Trace, so I'll cover a little bit about my background there. I was back in the day sort of the outdoor guy in high school and college, and that led to a career in an exceedingly small field of study known as recreation ecology. Essentially, that means that I do research on visitor impacts to protected natural areas, including backcountry, wilderness, all the different agencies. And it was an amazing, fateful career. I wouldn't change one thing. And so I'm retired now and pleased to be able to share some of what I've learned over that career. I was with the National Park Service for most of it, and then they moved all of us over to the USGS, US Geological Survey. But I've been stationed here at Virginia Tech and an adjunct professor here since 1989, so a good long time. Relative to Leave No Trace, I was invited because of my research in the early days by NOLS, National Outdoor Leadership School, who had worked with the federal agencies to develop Leave No Trace, to be a founding member of the board of directors in the early 90s. I then, because I was a scientist, they gave me the job of heading up and chairing the Education Review Committee, which is a committee tasked with refining and perfecting, further developing the Leave No Trace principles and practices. And so we had a committee made up of representatives from the agencies and from NOLS and Outward Bound and other nonprofit groups. And we basically sat around and debated L&T practices for hours and hours and hours. We also developed the educational courses, the trainer and the master educator course. They now call it level 1, level 2. And a lot of the pamphlets and literature. And then in 2014, I finished authoring their official book, Leave No Trace in the Outdoors. If you go to the Hennessy Hammock site, I think you can buy that book for like $8 now. I think it's $14 on Amazon. At any rate, with that as a background, I'm going to jump in. This presentation kind of tries to share the science behind some of the L&T practices. Obviously, I don't have time to go into all that stuff, but I'm going to focus probably mostly on the travel and camp on durable surfaces principle, but I've got some material from each of the different 7 principles. So as I said at the start, I'm a recreation ecologist. There's literally just, a handful of us. I think there's probably only 3 or 4 people in the United States today that would introduce themselves as a recreation ecology scientist who focuses, solely on that kind of science. And you see some pictures here of some of my grad students and I out measuring these kinds of impacts. So we measure them and then do analytical work, relational analyses, modeling to try to understand how do these impacts occur and why do they occur and what are the influential factors which may be use related or not. I mean, it could be, how durable is the vegetation type. And from that science and that modeling work that we do, we try to then come up with implications for management. And in this case, we're going to focus on those related to Leave No Trace and low impact education. So that's what I'm about today. Let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to start by just sort of highlighting fairly quickly some of these vegetation and resource impacts, soil, wildlife, water quality kinds of impacts that we see out there. And we'll start with vegetation. When you trample sort of pristine natural vegetation, you reduce its height. You can reduce its compositional makeup from, perhaps 20 species in the offsite areas to perhaps just less than 4, 5, or 6 species on site. And some of those species can be not native to the area, like dandelions and plantain and other sorts of, chickweed. Those are commonly found on campsites. And then if you continue to that, add more trampling, you eventually lose the vegetation cover altogether. Vegetation is relatively fragile and you're going to lose it completely and expose and then trample up sort of the organic litter that underlies the vegetation. That organic litter is, again, not very durable, recreationally durable from trampling. And so it gets sort of pulverized and then it breaks down, it speeds up the breakdown process. and then it gets lost through either wind erosion or water erosion more commonly. Some of it gets trampled into the soil underneath, which to some extent can be a good thing. But the loss of organic litter, the exposure of that underlying soil, which can then erode and wash away and erode into streams and lakes and other water bodies, which is a really bad thing. And that, of course, exposes rocks and roots and it makes the entire site sort of less aesthetically attractive to visitors, more difficult to use. You know, who wants to put up their tent on that lower picture there? And people then tend to move over, which makes campsites larger, which is what we absolutely don't want. Where, you know, one of the primary goals of resource protection related to visitation is to minimize the footprint of really intensive trampling disturbance. And so we want our trails to be narrow. We want our campsites to be small footprint campsites. And we don't want any more trails and any more campsites than we absolutely have to support that recreation provision objective, which again is sort of a dual objective along with protecting the natural resources and conditions of those resources and the natural processes and so on and so forth. So that dual mandate is indeed threatened by recreational visitation, and managers are basically placed in that point of having to balance those two competing legal objectives. There is tension between those two objectives. And that's kind of where sort of recreation ecology comes in, is helping us understand all that and then helping us to develop insights into how to finesse these kinds of things. How do we support large amounts of recreational visitation while either avoiding or minimizing the resulting resource impacts? I won't be talking too much today about sort of the social impacts of crowding conflicts and those sorts of things, but those are also clearly very important. I'm more on the resource side, but virtually 95% of my colleagues are, in fact, social scientists. They are far more numerous than recreation ecologists. Okay, so some of the concerns, in addition to just those straight impacts to sort of veg, soil, water quality, and wildlife, is the sort of proliferation of campsites and expansion of campsites, and that's where a lot of the sort of aerial extent of human impact occurs on the landscape. And so we're going to focus a little more attention on those and the travel and camp on durable surfaces principle today. And this is a representation or an image from some studies that my colleague David Cole, he was my mentor. He was with the Forest Service, the Aldo Leopold Research Unit, Wilderness Research Unit out in Montana, Missoula. And he did this study in the Three Sisters Wilderness in Oregon. The PCT goes right through it. So I hiked through it last year when I did that section of the PCT. And I saw lots and lots, not all these, but I saw lots of campsites. And you could question whether all of these campsites are indeed necessary. And in fact, his research clearly shows that you don't need all of these campsites, that visitors, if left to themselves under kind of a dispersed camping practice or policy, will indeed create way more campsites than they really need. And so a lot of these campsites are only used not that many nights per year, like less than 10. And so that suggests to me that we have too many campsites, which equates to me at least as avoidable impact. I call that avoidable impact. If you've got more impact than you really truly need to support the use, that's avoidable. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. We really need to work hard to get rid of it. On the East Coast, in contrast, I've done a number of different studies, particularly along the Appalachian Trail. And the worst of the worst in the Appalachian Trail back in the year 2000, when I started doing a lot of collaboration and partnering with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and the community of volunteers who take care of the AT. I've been working with them pretty closely for the last 25 years. The worst of the worst was Annapolis Rocks, another place called Slaughter Gap down in Georgia. And we did some additional research and adaptive management work in both places. I've just recently gotten a journal article accepted, which looked at longitudinally what we did at Annapolis Rocks to resolve those problems. So that'll be coming out soon. But in a nutshell, here's what we found. Some of these statistics that you're looking at the screen and some of the views and the vistas here of the campsite, makes it look pretty nasty. And it was. It was sort of a mega cluster of very large campsites. Many of these campsites had grown together over the years. And some of the worst tree damage that I've ever seen in my entire career occurred here. It's a fairly accessible place along the Appalachian Trail, has a wonderful vista. And we're going to return to that in a little bit, and I'll show you one of the things that we did there, kind of the most important thing we did there. So we'll come back to that. Common trail impacts, you've seen these as well, muddiness and widening, but quite frankly, soil loss. I talked about this yesterday in a presentation on trails. Soil loss, I think, is the most profound and ecologically and managerially significant form of impact for trails. Once you lose that soil, it's essentially gone forever. It's not going to come back in our lifetime, short of putting it into wheelbarrows and bringing it back in that way. And so, these are considerable problems that managers have to deal with. And quite frankly, Leave No Trace isn't quite as adept at responding to trail impacts as it is to camping kinds of impacts, in my sort of judgment. So let's get into the L&T message a little bit, and I'm actually going to sort of surprise you a little bit and show you why it often doesn't work with a slide here coming up. The first thing I want to leave you with is that Leave No Trace practices are indeed science-based. When I worked with Knowles in those early days and with the board of directors, that first decade, in developing a lot of the principles, I actually wrote a proposal to alter the principles from 6 to 7. We combined 2 and added 2 new ones. We were able to add the one on wildlife, for example. It was always science-based. I was involved from the very beginning. David Cole, in fact, was involved for the 6 or 7 years prior to my involvement. And we made sure that the Leave No Trace practices all are, to the extent they can be, science-based. And so I'll assure you of that, and hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll agree with me. But bottom line, we're trying to influence various kinds of influential factors. And those could be use-related factors like type and amount and season of use. We're trying to influence environmental factors like, where do we camp? Do we camp on this veg type or that veg type? Or do we try to avoid veg entirely and camp on rock or durable surfaces? And then finally, managerial factors. Do we disperse use or do we concentrate and contain use to the most sustainable locations? And so there's a wide variety of things. I call it the management toolbox that we reach into and we pull tools out. And education has always been our favorite tool, quite frankly. It's indirect to the extent that it works. It avoids us having to go out and apply heavy-handed regulatory kinds of actions and enforce those. It avoids having to go out and manipulate the resource and harden trails, for example, put gravel down on trails or stone up the surfaces of trails or require people to carry bear canisters or things like that. It's a lower impact on the user kind of an approach. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work. And so I'm going to sort of run you through a model here that I was made aware of by a colleague of mine, Bob Manning. He's also retired now. Used to be at Vermont, and he sort of said, well, it's challenging to do L&T and make it work, and you need to know about this and why it's challenging if you're going to go out in the world and try to influence human behavior. And so it's kind of important to know about some of the weaknesses of our educational model before we try to implement that model. So let's begin. So the first step in our sort of educational sequence to get people to willingly, voluntarily adopt a low impact practice. In other words, we're trying to get them to substitute a high impact practice for a low impact practice. So it might be like, oh, we don't want you to just stick your food on a rock and leave it out there at night while you're sleeping. Any kind of animal can come and get it. We want you to protect it by hanging it in a bear bag or putting it in a bear canister. What do we have to do to accomplish that substitution of a low impact practice for a high impact practice? The first is we need to expose those individuals, those visitors, to a message, an educational message. So if you put your educational message on a trailhead sign, and the visitors get out of their car and pack up their packs and head on down the trail and never even glance at your nice trailhead sign, it's game over before we've even started the hike. Okay. That's how easy it is to miss the mark. Once they see that sign, they actually have to go over to it and pay attention to it, and they have to process that message. If it's not in their, sort of core language, let's say they are German visitors and it's in English, then again, game over. They've seen the message, they've paid attention to it, but maybe they can't read it, or maybe they can only read a bit, or maybe it's a 6-year-old child and you've written the message for a 18-year-old adult. They may not comprehend that message. And so again, could be game over right there. There's a series of sort of steps here that we have to get people to the very end. And if they get off course, if they step off this message trail at any point, again, it's game over. This next block, I think personally is the most interesting to me, and I think quite frankly, it's the linchpin to the whole thing. And that is that you've got to craft a message, and you've got to get them to yield to it. You've got to get them to the point where they say, you know what? That's right. I agree with that. I totally agree with that. If I don't do this, some animal is going to be impacted in some negative way, and that's not okay. That's not okay with me. I need to change my behavior so that that animal, which is living in its habitat, in its home, where I'm a visitor, is going to do well with my visit. It's not going to be impacted by my visit. And so you've got to get them to yield. And the best thing I can say here is that you need to give them one or more compelling reasons that reaches out and grabs them, that they say, yeah, yeah, that's important. I agree with that. And they have to sort of yield to your message. So I think that's a really important one. Now, it may be that they read your message and, maybe it's in a brochure or an email or see it on social media in the middle of the winter time, and then they go out and recreate in the summer. They have to remember that. They have to retain that message. So that's, using not just words or visual cues, but sound. I mean, if you hit them with all of the senses, sound and visual and sort of looking at words and diagrams and things that can be more effective in helping them retain that message or helping them yield to that message even. And then finally, they have to behave in a way that's consistent with this sort of new changed attitude that, they say, yeah, no, I need to do this. And I need to just, literally change what I do when I'm out in the field. We've done all kinds of social science studies, my colleagues have, that show that in many cases, visitors know the right thing to do. They just don't do it. And why don't they do it? Well, it's a little more work. If I'm going to dig a cat hole, I need a trowel, and I need to spend the time to dig a good cat hole, and I need to spend the time to find the right place to dig that cat hole. And I need to know where to dig that cat hole. And so it is work. It's additional work, for visitors to sort of follow these behaviors. Our challenge is to make that just sort of second nature, or to give them the compelling reasons that they, need to truly alter their behavior, not just their knowledge. And then finally, if you make it through the entire path of all of these steps to the very end, and you've still got that visitor with us, then conceivably you can actually affect a positive change on the environment in terms of protecting resources, or in the social environment of protecting the quality of social experiences. And quite frankly, the managers that I speak with at the Washington office level, that's what they care about the most. When I talk with superintendents and forest supervisors, that's what they care about the most. They want to accomplish real changes in real conditions. They don't want the visitors to just know the right thing to do. They want visitors doing the right thing, and they want to see trails improve and campsites improve and wildlife improve and everything else out there. And as we add more and more visitors every year, this challenge becomes exceedingly important to everyone, quite frankly. And so, at any rate, that's kind of where we're at with sort of the Leave No Trace educational process. Hopefully, you've learned something from that model that makes you realize quite the challenge that we all have in trying to affect, changes, voluntary changes in human behavior, which is what Leave No Trace is all about. And I don't apologize for that to anyone. I mean, some people say, "Oh, the government shouldn't be telling the visitors what to do." And the book that I wrote, my own agency sat on the book for almost an entire year because the policy people looked at it and said, "This is the government telling people how to behave in the outdoors." And I said, "Absolutely, yes. I'm not going to apologize for that. It is the government and the entire environmental community saying that you need to consider that your behavior in the outdoors is jeopardizing the quality of the natural resources and recreational experiential quality for other visitors. And we do, in fact, want you to voluntarily learn about this and voluntarily change your behavior." And there are certainly elements in the government that absolutely disagree with that, that we shouldn't be telling visitors how to behave. I don't apologize for that. That's what we're trying to do. If we don't do it through education, then we're going to do it through regulation, which is way worse. Or we're going to go out there and manipulate the environment. We're going to be putting in stone staircases. We're going to be putting in, big, bear boxes, steel boxes in the wilderness. Is that okay? One way or the other, we're going to have to solve this problem. I guess the other option is that we just simply eliminate use. We start, severely reducing use in these amazing places. And I don't want to do that either. I want the most visitors possible out there having an amazing time in the wilderness in the backcountry. But the impacts, quite frankly, are unacceptable, particularly those that are entirely avoidable. So that's kind of my personal sort of, I don't know, perspective on all this. So let's go ahead and start and run through the principles. The first one is plan ahead and prepare. We know, for example, with respect to campsites, that they are most frequently created and expanded during peak use periods. And so, for example, every year on the AT, Appalachian Trail, we have this through hiker bubble of insanely high use, thousands of more than, 1,500 people starting down in Georgia, and they're headed to Maine, okay, in that year. And these through hikers come through, and we've noticed that there are times and places where there's 100 people looking to camp in one gap with one spring nearby. And you can imagine how many campsites 100 people need in one gap. And you can imagine the nightmare that land managers have dealing with that. And so, clearly we'd rather spread that bubble out and flatten that bubble. And we'd like to do it through leave no trace rather than regulations if we can. So that's just one example. Pick your park, they all have periods of peak use. Pick your national forest, all or wilderness, they all have periods of peak use. If we can get those folks to spread out in time and space, we can reduce the demand for large numbers of campsites in one place that are only used perhaps 3 weeks a year. And then the rest of the year, people rotate around those sites, preventing any of them from really recovering. Wouldn't it be way better to have a smaller peak use, a smaller number of sites, and therefore a smaller total aerial aggregate or aggregate area of camping disturbance basically. So if we can flatten the bubble, we have the ability to reduce aggregate impact from an aerial extent or even impact severity extent, quite frankly. Social impact's the same. If you've got these intensive peak periods of use, you've got crowding, you've got conflict, you've got all kinds of things happening. So you're diminishing both the resource and social quality when you have this peak use. And so one of the things Leave No Trace tries to do is to get people to sort of seek out less used areas, less used times. If you can take a trip on weekdays versus a weekend, that's better. If you can avoid the particularly heavy use, if you are going to go out on a really popular Memorial or Labor Day weekend, don't go to the popular places. Go to some, really remote, less used place, and avoid the problems that will be happening in those really peak use places. Um, all right, so let's see. Times of the year when resources are particularly vulnerable. Well, the spring, when, basically whenever the soils are really wet. Vegetation and soils are far more sensitive to trampling impacts when they're wet than when they're dry. Think of a trail. You go out, and the picture here on the right, every footstep in that wet soil is going to shift that soil around and displace it from one place to another. It's maybe going to make the hole deeper, which will attract and hold more water. You go out in that same trail in that same place in, say, the driest part of July and early August and you could have literally 100 times the use and have way less impact on a per capita basis. That's kind of a duh. That's kind of a given in recreation ecology. Wildlife also are very sensitive during certain times of the year, generally when they're raising their young. It doesn't matter what species it is. When they have young with them, they're very sensitive to your disturbance, to your presence, to your noise. If you're walking straight towards them, for example, or making a lot of noise, they're going to be way, way more concerned and alarmed, and their flight distances will actually increase. Well, the distance that you can approach them will increase, at which point they get up and run away, fly away, and that sort of thing. Um, Experimental trampling studies reveal that trampling impacts can be avoided, minimized when and so we've done these studies where we literally go out and have lanes of vegetation, and this lane gets 1,000 tramples, and trample is just sort of one pass up and down the lane. We have little clickers that we use. And the least trampling might be 25 passes, or well, there's also the control where it's 0 passes. So we do these experimental trampling studies in different veg types and different soil types, and we then make statements about relative susceptibility to trampling damage. And what this type of research has shown repeatedly is that it's quite frankly best to just simply avoid vegetation whenever you can. So stick to rock and snow and naturally barren substrates. If you got a camp, you might consider camping on a sandy, gravelly bar along, say, the Ozark Riverway, at least during the summertime when the water levels are low and those sandbars and stuff are high. And when it's safe to do so. I mean, for sure, you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is very safe. If you're going to camp in the arid West in sort of a bottomland area, ravine type spot that's barren naturally of vegetation because it gets flashed and flash flood is, in the springtime, for example, or when it's going to rain. But you can use these places when it's not going to rain. And of course, you need to know something about the weather and be safe. But bottom line, you're always looking for naturally barren places. Along the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon, there's naturally barren, sort of beachy kinds of places. They get wiped out every, several times a year by high water, but most of the time they're high and dry and safe to use. And that's where we camp and that's where we hang out. If you're on trails, we want you to walk in the center of the formal trail. If you can see that visitors are abandoning the formal trail and walking on alternative sort of co-aligned trails, multiple trails, braided trails and things, we want to avoid that. We want to try to get you to stay on the main trail. Now, if the agency hasn't done their work and they give you an insanely muddy trail, I don't feel like it's our, responsibility to walk through the middle of the deepest mud holes. I tend to look for rocks and try to, move from rock to rock. I tend to, skirt the closest edge of the mud hole so that I don't completely destroy my footwear. Some people will walk right through the middle of it. Sometimes if I'm out doing canyoneering, I walk right through the stream all day long. That's a durable place to walk, quite frankly. But bottom line, don't go way around mud holes and create these aneurysms of informal or social trails around these kinds of impact problems, because now you truly are, doubling, tripling, quadrupling the sort of aerial extent of human impact from these sort of bad places, these trails that haven't been maintained well. Confine traffic to non-vegetated organic litter is kind of the next best thing. So you find really dense forests if you're looking for a campsite, so dense that in fact there's less than, say, 10%, maybe even less than 5% veg cover. And so there's just lots of organic litter. And so you could move some sticks and pine cones and put up your tent and camp on the organic litter. That's potentially a good place. You're not on veg. You might pulverize a little bit of that stuff, but that's a process that's happening anyways. You're just speeding up the pulverization over organic litter just a bit when you camp on it. If you do need to camp on vegetation, there is a lot of research, and it's very reliable research, which says that grasses and sedges, or graminoids, are way, 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 way more resistant to trampling, and they recover. They're resilient from trampling than forbs, than herbaceous plants, or sort of these broad-leafed herbs that you see in the forests. And so we'll see some pictures here in a few minutes to illustrate some of this. And here's sort of some photos from one of the experimental trampling studies I did with my mentor and colleague David Cole before he retired. And so here on the left we see this is a forested community. It's about 85 to 95% overstory. And underneath on the ground, under this forest canopy, there's literally 100% coverage of herbs, these broadleaf herbs or forbs. And 1,000 passes is going to wipe those out entirely. I don't care where you are in the United States, 1,000 passes will wipe that stuff out entirely. And if you come back in a month, what you'll find is that of the 20 or so species that were there in these quads, in these lanes of vegetation that we trampled, there may be two or three that come back, that bounce back, that are resilient within a month. And they tend to be the species that have corms as roots, or rhizomes that have sort of starchy materials that allow these plants to kind of bounce back quickly. In other words, a storage vehicle in a root. Right, literally in this particular study, the grassy lanes were only about 30 yards away, but it was, and same soil, same everything, except that the trees weren't there. It was a just, naturally sunny area. There was maybe 5 or 15% tree cover. And grasses are shade intolerant. They don't grow under shade very well. Or out in the sun, they tend to be insanely resistant to trampling and insanely resilient to trampling. And these two pictures prove that and they're representative of all the studies that David Cole has done. He's done way more of these studies than I did. But these grasses, this is 1,000 passes. You can't even see the ground here. You've just trampled them down. And yeah, they look kind of dead-ish. But you come back a month later, and I can tell you that this bottom right picture is indistinguishable from the control picture that got 0 tramples. All right. And so literally in 1 month, these trampled grasses that got 1,000 passes and looked awful, but didn't go away, completely bounced back. They are highly resilient. There's a reason why we put grasses on our football fields, our soccer fields, our yards, and so on and so forth. Now, I will emphasize here that the grasses have to be in nearly full sun to have these qualities. If you put grasses in shady areas, A, they don't do well, and B, they aren't that resistant to trampling, and C, they don't respond and they aren't as resilient. They don't recover as fast from trampling when grasses are in shade. And so, quite frankly, it boils down to how much sun is there. If you have a lot of sun, then the grasses are very, very durable. And unfortunately, in the Pacific Crest Trail community of managers, and I'm not going to just pick on the Forest Service because the Park Service is saying the same thing out there. They say, "Oh, don't camp in the meadows." Well, quite frankly, they're wrong, and I'm going to stand here and say that right now. Now, I think in some cases they're talking about small, tiny meadows filled with lots of beautiful wildflowers, and there's so few of them they want to protect them. I don't have any problem with that. But there are lots of places where the meadows go on forever. They're huge. And yeah, sometimes they have a few flowers in them, but so do the woods. And so now, if you have a choice, don't camp on the veg. Again, I said that in the beginning. Camp on rock, camp on bare organic, soil or mineral soil, whatever. Camp in places where there's no veg. But if you have to camp on either 100% herbs or 100% grasses, there's no decision here. It's black and white. Camp on the grasses. So I'll stop and get off my soapbox now. But here's some pictures. I was a Boy Scout master for 5 years, and then I was a venture crew leader for 19 years. And my venture crew is predominantly young women, like the woman you see here. And we did lots and lots of trips. This is my venture crew out on the Pacific Crest Trail. We did big summer trips out there. We went canyoneering, very high adventure oriented group. All three of these pictures are from my venture crew years. And so I have a lot of those kinds of pictures here. But you can see in the upper left here, they're camping, they're doing their most intensive, sort of cooking dinner activity on granite, and it doesn't even have any lichen on it. Okay, so this is a very durable place. And you can see a couple other girls over here on a different piece of granite doing the exact same thing. It's not hard. It's not rocket science. It's quite easy, quite frankly. It's like a table. Here's some venture crew girls and a few guys that are hammock camping, and way, way, way less impact on the ground. I've been camping with a hammock. I hiked probably 3/4 of the Appalachian Trail solo and used a hammock the entire time. And so I've spent hundreds and hundreds of nights in a hammock where I've perfected, and I'm going to show you a slide on that here in a minute. But it's the ultimate in low impact camping, particularly when you do what I call natural site camping and in a dispersal mode, which I'll get to. In this picture here, you can see we've got our tents, which we have tent stakes. These are not freestanding tents, on the grasses, but we're cooking over here. And this is a naturally barren, rocky area that I found when we were looking for a place to camp that night. So we're all hanging out over there. We even played hacky sack right in this area on the bedrock. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sort of the use impact curve or relationship. This is a pretty important element of recreation ecology research, so pay attention. That's the professor in me. I gave lots and lots of lectures at Virginia Tech University over the years. Even though I was a federal scientist, I was stationed at Virginia Tech, and my office was in there with the faculty members and worked with grad students for, my entire career. Okay, so this impact relationship between different types of resource impacts and the amount of use is what I call asymptotic or curvilinear. And what I mean by that, if you look at this diagram, is that most of these impacts have maximal impact to them, most of these indicators, with quite low levels of use. Like, in other words, by the time you get up to about 12 to 15 nights of camping per year, the majority of impact, resource impact to that campsite has already occurred. Once you get past this, 10 to 15 nights of use per year, in this case it was 10, but in other studies it was maybe 12 or as much as 15, but not more than 15. And these are studies we've done all over the US and some people have done in other countries. At that point, once you reach that sort of apex or inflection point, you might want to call it, you can double, triple, quadruple use, and the amount of additional impact that occurs is minimal. So the per capita amount of impact that occurs beyond this level of 10 to, let's say, 15 nights of use per year of camping um, is fairly negligible, quite frankly. And so what you want to do is have a very small number of sites and use them very intensively. So let me go ahead and kind of run through this scenario. I came up with sort of a model that I have used over the years. It's been published in various places. But we start out with this relationship, this asymptotic curvilinear relationship. And we ask the question, what are the implications of this for how we manage visitors, how we educate visitors to leave no trace? So I ask you to consider a place that has, hypothetically 3 campsites that each get about 15 nights of use per year. And so we have 3 times an A level of impact from an aggregate perspective, okay, cumulative aggregate. Now, we might be able to take that 45 total nights of use per year and put it on 45 different campsites. And in fact, they wouldn't even be called a campsite. You're just looking for a place that has literally never ever been camped on before, and you put one night of use there. And I don't care if you're camping on herbs or even ferns, you could camp anywhere in the United States for one night and come back a year later, which is kind of my definition of recovery, and see absolutely no disturbance whatsoever. You could be on a bed of ferns, camp one night, come back 1 year later, and there would be no disturbance from pre-camping the year before. It would look totally pristine and natural. And we've in fact I've actually done that in a variety of different veg types personally, and I've even done it with my venture crew where we had 20 people camping, or well, maybe not that many, 15 camping, and I've come back a year later and seen no impact whatsoever visible. So an absolute pure dispersal, call it natural site camping. I used to call it pristine site camping, but folks have convinced me to stop using that word in wilderness. And this level of dispersal, bottom line, works. So it is a viable option for camping, and it's the one that I use, quite frankly, the most. Now, can we get everyone in the world to do that? Absolutely not. It would be an abject failure of a policy if you tried to get everyone to do that. And so for the masses, quite frankly, the opposite direction makes the most sense. And I think you'll realize that here in a minute. So let's say we've got these three campsites. They each have 15 nights of use per year. And so we got 45 nights to deal with. Well, you could select, and we now have the capability to do this, the most sustainable of these three campsites. And you keep that one, and you're a manager or a steward, and you close the other two. And I don't have time to get into the details of how you do that, but I've written about it a lot. And you so you pick the most sustainable site, you put all the use on that site. Now, if you believe this curve, and I implore you to accept it, you just went from 3 times an A level of cumulative or aggregate impact to a 1 times B level of cumulative or aggregate impact. And I ask you the question, which is better? Hopefully you'll answer 1 times B is way better than 3 times A from a cumulative perspective. And it's as simple as that. This is now a containment strategy or a concentration strategy, and it's way, way, way more effective than a dispersal strategy that's failed. And that's kind of where the inflection point is. In most of the studies where I go out and the agency has a dispersed camping strategy, it seems like the typical campsite is right in this area around the inflection point. It's the worst possible place you could ever want to be. You either need to be way down here, one night of use per year, maybe a few nights of use per year. Obviously, if you're in canyoneering situation and you're camping on bedrock, this doesn't even need to be a few nights per year. It could be a dozen. It could be 50. And if you're on granite and self freestanding tent, you could camp as much as you want. But generally, you're not on something quite that resistant and durable. You might be just on organic litter, or you might be out in a meadow on vegetation, on grass vegetation, in which case, 1 to 3 nights per year down here will work. But more than that, and you quickly create a campsite, which is where you don't want to be. And so you either want to be here or you want to be way out here on the far right, and the more the better. And so, for example, in Grand Canyon National Park, if you go down to the bottom of the canyon and camp, and trying to think, the name of the place is escaping me now, but there's campground down there, and the campsites get probably 365 nights of use per year. That's the ultimate in a containment strategy, quite frankly. And so that's the most efficient, most effective camping management policy you could possibly have. But bottom line, it's either of these two policies. And you'll notice, hopefully, that Leave No Trace is entirely based on this knowledge. And so if you think now about your Leave No Trace hang tags and what you've read about Leave No Trace, we basically say concentrate your use in popular high use areas and disperse your use. And here I'm saying pristine areas, but people like me to use the word natural now, or remote areas. And so here's my hammock, and I'm camping above, and this is just naturally barren. I'm literally far, far away from any shelter or any known campsite. Okay, I walk on the AT or whatever trail I'm on until I'm tired and I want to go to bed, cook my dinner and go to bed. I wander off into the woods. I find two big trees to put my hammock on. I have wide straps, and I'll get back to that in a minute. I'm hopefully over non-vegetated surfaces or very lightly vegetated surfaces. The beauty of a hammock is you could be over a rock pile and it would be just fine, thank you. If I'm forced to not, if I want to do this disperse, this extreme, pure form of dispersal, there's no campsites around, then I might put my tent up on this grassy meadow. And as you can see, there's hardly any trees around here. And then these two girls in my venture crew have managed to find the only piece of bedrock sticking up out of the grass to cook their dinner on. Okay, so they found a resistant, durable surface to cook dinner on. The opposite is you find a pre-existing campsite, hopefully one that's very sustainable. Maybe the agencies have gone through all their campsites and picked out the most sustainable ones, and then put either dots on the map or dots on controversial phone apps. Like it or not, a very large and increasing number of visitors are now using phone apps for navigation in wilderness and backcountry. I've been using phone apps for years, more than a decade on the AT when I finished that in 2015. And now I'm working on the PCT, the Pacific Crest Trail, and I use a phone app every day to figure out where I am and where I'm going and where I'm going to camp. And so all you have to do is put the resistant sustainable sites into the phone app and leave all the rest out. And you're gonna, voila, solve this age-old dilemma of how do we get people to camp on the right sites, the ones that aren't too close to the water, the ones that aren't too close to the trail, the ones that are more durable and resistant, where we can have double, triple, quadruple the use, and they won't get huge over time. In other words, they're topographically constrained by, vegetation, by preferably by topography, or they're exceptionally rocky off-site and quite nice on-site. A little more on that later. Okay, so hammock straps, I promised to elaborate on this just a little bit. I can't spend too much time on this, but again, here's one of my campsites on the AT. We did a bit of a study. One of my venture crew girls did. This is literally a AP science class she had in high school, and she came to me and said, "I have to do a real study. Would you be my mentor?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so I convinced her to do a study looking at the effects of hammock camping on trees. And what we found was that the paracord or rope was just way, way, way too narrow, and that it indented the bark substantially and left both visual and possibly sort of a degradation of the bark that had some meaning to the tree. I'm not convinced of that. But bottom line, it absolutely messed up the bark when you use something as narrow as paracord or a rope. 1 inch straps, a lot of hammocks, I believe, use 1 inch straps. Those are acceptable, but quite frankly, the Hennessy hammock uses 2 inch straps, and that's what I've always used. And those were absolutely perfect at distributing the weight of the hammock onto the bark to protect the bark. We saw virtually no compression of bark from the 2 inch straps. Again, just one night. A tight hang substantially increases by 290% the force that a hammock places on the trees compared to a loose hang. So when you're setting up your hammock, if you pull that sucker as tight as you can, that's a tight hang. You're doing an insane more and quite frankly unnecessary damage to the tree. And so sort of an intermediate or a loose, not a loose hang, but a light hang on the trees. It's not really going to affect the quality of your sleeping. It's going to go taut either way. Choose trees that are greater than 6 inches in diameter, preferably without, big leafy sort of foliose lichens on the bark. sort of hard bark. Certain trees have really hard bark, others have cork-like bark, so you might try to pick trees that have hard bark. And then set up your hammock and cook on really the most durable non-vegetated surface you can find. And also, by the way, if you're camping with a bunch of folks that use tents, which you often are, then the hammocks should really go in the places where the tents can't go. In other words, you really want to preserve the best tenting spots for tents. And then ideally you should camp if you're with a group and they're camping on a campsite. You should really be on the campsite or real close to the edge of it. You don't want to go just off site and then be constantly trampling back and forth to your hammock camping place, which could potentially expand the size of that campsite if enough people did it. You really want to be on the campsite. Just don't be over a perfect camping spot for a tent, unless it's not necessary, I guess. And so then this dispersed natural site camping that I mentioned and showed with that diagram, I wanted to give you a visual cue of what that looks like. So here's my wife and I were camping with the venture crew on a Pacific Crest Trail backpacking trip. And we did this natural or pristine site camping one night. And here's the tent that's set up. And it's literally not on top of any of these yucca plants that you see. I mean, I would not want to camp on top of a yucca plant. So I very carefully positioned the tent to avoid that. One of them ended up in the vestibule. So what? We just avoided it. We didn't trample it either. And then we took down the tent, and I spent, and I'm not teasing you on this, I spent no more than about 5 or 7 minutes renaturalizing this site. It's not that onerous, quite frankly. I renaturalized the site to make it look as natural as possible. And when we walked away, if someone came hiking through here in a day or two or a week later, they would see literally no indication whatsoever that anyone had ever camped here. Ideally later that day, but you do a little bit of trampoline damage. But certainly within a week, all signs of that have disappeared. And in fact, that's your goal. You don't want anyone to see this spot and say, oh, I should camp there. Because now you've gone from that 1 or 2 nights of use per year to, possibly 10 or 15 nights, and that will create a brand new campsite. So you've just started that process of creating a brand new campsite if you don't restore your campsite after using it in this mode of camping, okay? So sort of dispersed natural site camping is what I call this. And then concentration or camping or containment camping with established sites or formal designated sites is the other method of camping. That's kind of my nomenclature. I think that's pretty much it. So let's look at some, sort of on the more common side of containment or concentration, established site camping, designated site camping, whatever you want to call it. What do those sites look like? Well, I suggest to you that agencies really need to go through and look at, do an inventory and monitoring of all their campsites. And while they're doing that, we have developed a bunch of new sustainability assessment indicators. Actually, there's just a few. And if you include those into your field inventory and monitoring program, just a few extra indicators, you can have the ability to go through the thousands of campsites. And when I say thousands, I mean it. Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park has like 6,000 to 8,000 campsites. The Boundary Water Canary Wilderness in northern Minnesota has 2,000 campsites. We're talking thousands. We often don't need as many as these agencies find when they do their inventories and monitoring. And so we apply these sort of sustainability indicators, these 2 or 3 new indicators that I'm happy to share. They're in a new book that I'm about to publish that will be free on the online that anyone can download, and all the best procedures are in the appendices of this new book. And apply those and then pick the most sustainable sites. And then the challenge is, how do we get visitors to find them? And that's where quite frankly, I totally embrace phone apps and phone app navigation. I think that's the future. I realize that some people have some angst and some challenges with the notion that we should be sort of embracing or encouraging the use of technology in the wilderness. And I guess my answer to that question is very simply, we are not in the decision process. Visitors are going to make those decisions regardless of what the agency managers feel or think. And the visitors have clearly made that decision. All of the youth that I hang out with are completely puzzled when I ask them if their use of a phone to navigate on the Pacific Crest Trail, for example, diminishes the extent to which they feel like they're in wilderness. They don't even understand what I'm asking them. It clearly, at least in my impression, does not degrade the quality of their wilderness experience. You can disagree with me. Maybe we can discuss that here in a little bit. But I'm being insanely pragmatic about this. And this is one of the most powerful tools that we have ever created. And I'm pretty strongly opposed to not using it. At any rate, the sloping terrain that you see here in this picture, for example, prevents site expansion. The rockiness in this picture, the rockiness in this picture tends to prevent the expansion of these sites. These are really good sustainable sites. You can even go further. If you're in a place where there aren't any naturally occurring sustainable sites, you can make them. Now, this is, something that's a little more debatable. We've done this on the Appalachian Trail. There are now something this suggests 725 side hill campsites. It's probably up to 1,000 now along the AT. We've been doing this since the year 2000. It's been widely adopted by the 32 trail clubs that maintain and manage the Appalachian Trail. Go talk to them. The agencies have condoned this in the AT community. In the PCT community, they have completely pushed back against this concept. Again, I'm frustrated by it. I think they're wrong. I think the AT community will prove them that this is the way to go, but who knows? We'll see how it all shakes out in 10 years. But these are side hill campsites where we've gone through and we've done nothing different than what we've been doing in wilderness for decades, maybe, well, since wilderness was created in 64. You've heard of side hill trails? These are side hill campsites. They're no different, absolutely no different. We're using cut and fill methods to create a small, flat, tiny postage stamp sized campsite for people that's barely big enough for their tent and a little room on the side to cook and eat dinner. I argue that this is the epitome of low impact camping, even though it was a constructed feature in wilderness or backcountry or whatever in your national forest. And so we did this at Annapolis Rocks, and we had all of those campsites that you saw, the nightmare of impact that you saw in that earlier slide, 43,000 square feet of intensively trampled camping area was replaced by 14 new side hill campsites with a total aggregate of 3,000 square feet. All right, that's a 92% reduction in the total aerial extent of human impact at this place where people camp very intensively. And the visitors, in fact, there's a journal paper that shows that the visitors loved the new campsites. They felt like they were in a very pristine natural environment. They were separated from all the other people camping around them because we put these sites about 200 feet apart or more. So there was natural quiet, there was solitude, there was the lack of conflict with their visitors and the lack of crowding. The ecological conditions have stayed largely the same over the years, and this new paper that will be published soon is documenting that success, that they continued to stay very small. A few of them expanded. Which ones expanded? The ones that were in the most flat terrain. You've got to go to terrain that is more than about 15% grade for this practice to work. It turns out that if you're walking around in 15% grade with a tent that you're desperate to erect, that you will be very unhappy. And you're only going to find these side hill spots that have been created for you to use. And so you have to have 15% or greater terrain. 20% is perfect. I think I'll quit there and keep going. I don't have a lot of time. Another soapbox issue for me. Traveling. We're still kind of in this travel and camp on durable surfaces principle here. But this is where recreation ecology has the most, sort of um, the most data to share, the most implications to share. So again, we have this dichotomy that gets back to that curvilinear asymptotic use impact relationship that we showed earlier. In popular places, you should really stay on the most well-used, designated, or well-established trail you can find. In other words, a total containment concentration strategy. Stay on the dang trail. And as you can see in this picture, people were on this trail and they found this to be slightly too rough. This is the trail leading up to Half Dome, okay, up in Yosemite Valley. And they didn't like the rockiness of this trail. I look at that and say, what's wrong with that trail? And they moved over. And so the agency came in and piled stuff on that trail, which they should do. And then what did people do? They moved over to the other side. Now, this is something that Leave No Trace can and should address. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a great track record of success here, but we're, improving every day, I think. Bottom line, I look at this and say the trail's in the wrong dang place. Move the trail to a side hill trail, and you'll solve this problem completely with no education whatsoever involved. If you're on a side hill, the uphill and downhill sides of the trail are steep enough that you're going to stay on the dang trail. So that's what I would do in this situation. But Leave No Trace potentially can help. We should definitely be telling people stay on the trail. Now, it also means that we have to maintain and manage this trail and keep it in good, usable condition. And if it gets too rutted and rocky and rooty, then, well, I don't really blame the visitors for getting off the trail. That's a management function. Now, if you're in a really remote, low use area, then don't use trails at all. Don't even have trails, maybe, or just a few. And you do something called meadow walking. And my venture crew of high school youth, this is no big deal. We get to a meadow like this, and I don't even have to tell them. Maybe one of the older girls says meadow walking, and then the new kids learn how to do meadow walking. It's not rocket science. It's quite easy. You just don't walk directly in a line. You walk abreast of each other. Some of you have probably heard of cryptogams, a real common out west in the canyoneering places. Canyoneering is kind of my favorite outdoor activity now, right next to backpacking. And we find these crusts. These are biological crusts. They have algae and fungus that sort of commensally work together to create these crusts that make the soil fairly stable and non-erodible, but they're easily trampled into submission by footsteps. And so if you absolutely have to cross an area like this, then follow in each other's exact footsteps. And if you're on, sort of a trail that crosses, this kind of stuff, then stay on the narrow trail and keep it as narrow as you possibly can. Um, Sort of an example of extreme containment, right? Or concentration. All right, moving on. Dispose of waste properly. The rest I don't have quite as many things to share, so we'll go much faster. There are real problems with human health and for wildlife as well, and aesthetically. People don't like to see poop in the woods and step in it. I've done that. I've done thousands of campsite surveys, and all of my grad students have stepped in it at one point or another because it's probably 10% of the population that simply doesn't want to dig a cat hole. But bottom line, there are bacteria, there are protozoans like Giardia, and there are viruses that can affect water supplies. And if we're not careful with the way we manage poop in the backcountry, then we're going to get sick. And perhaps animals will also get sick. And there will be nasty aesthetic consequences as well. And so toilets, when there's a toilet available, use it. Burial, the cat hole method. But there are some places where we really literally need to pack it out. Fortunately, those are fairly few. And from my perspective, they're extremely cold places like alpine and Arctic places. They're extremely dry, and by that I mean desert, not just, backcountry of Yosemite. I mean desert. Even canyoneering, well, some canyoneering places are borderline desert. And then extremely wet places like wetlands. If you have really wet soil, stuff never decomposes. It's anaerobic. Okay, it can't. Cold, it won't decompose because of the cold. Desert, it won't decompose because there's no water. Decomposition requires water. And so there have been studies done where they've literally dug up human waste that's been planted in the ground various points of time. And certainly, even in a cat hole method that's dug well, you can dig it up a year later, there are still bacteria present. It takes a while for that stuff to go away, for that stuff to decompose. How long? Probably 2 to 3, 4 years, depending on the conditions of the soil, how cold it is, and how wet and dry it is, and that sort of things, but it does in fact decompose. And if you go away from campsites and away from trails and away from water and dig cat holes, then several years goes by, it's gone. It's the way to sort of deal with human waste in the backcountry. Um, there are some other methods. UV radiation, for example, is one. Some people have suggested that if you skim coat, if you're in a really remote place and you skim your human waste all over rocks in the ground, the UV radiation will desiccate it and dry it up and kill it all. It's insanely disgusting if you happen to see it, however. So we don't really recommend what's called the smear method. And then finally, I'll just simply say that it doesn't really take very much soil to filter out the nasty either bacteria or viruses or sort of what's the other one like Giardia. It doesn't take much soil to filter that stuff out. Literally, I've seen studies that suggest that 5 feet of sort of regular typical soil, not sort of granola soil like you'd find in some granite areas like Yosemite, but most soil types in 5 feet of soil can filter this stuff out, which means you could dig a cat hole 5 feet away from a creek and it would be effective. I don't recommend that. Why? Well, we know that we tell people to go 200 feet from any of these kinds of places to dig their cat hole. We know that of 100 people who go out to do the cat hole method, probably, and we don't really know how many, but I'm going to estimate that it's somewhere between 5 and 15% of people will just simply do surface disposal. And so if they do surface disposal and they're 200 feet away from things, the impacts are bad, but they're not horrible. If they do that 15 feet from a creek or water source, then the impacts are, beyond horrible. They're disastrous. You could get someone sick to the point where they would literally die. And so we tell people 200 feet, knowing that it could be, literally as little as 5 or 10 feet if you dig a deep cat hole. A few other things about this. Surface deposition is problematic due to aesthetics. Obviously, people step in it and see it and don't like it. Animals and insects, will eat this stuff. And when those flies land on that human waste, where are they going to land next? Well, to a fly, it's nothing to fly from where 200 feet away you dug your cat hole over to where you surface disposed your waste 200 feet away. From there to fly over and land on your dinner, at the campsite. That's nothing. They do it all the time. And so that's exactly how disease transmission occurs is from something like that, something that simple. Or you have a 3-inch rainstorm, which are more common now than they were 50 years ago. And that water from surface disposed human waste manages to overland flow during a 3-inch rainstorm when there's all kinds of water running across the surface of the ground, 200 feet right back into a stream, particularly if you picked a lowland area to put your waste in, your unburied waste in. And so fine textured soil, 200 feet from water, 6 to 8 inches, and that's kind of important to get it deep. We say 6 to 8 inches. It really does need to be at least, 4 to 6. Putting it just barely under the organic litter doesn't count. That's not good enough. And saying, oh, well, I'll just put it barely under the organic litter and then I'll stick a rock on top of it, again, doesn't count. If you get a 2-inch rainstorm, it's going to wash that stuff out. Group latrines, people often ask about that. Not generally recommended. You end up with such a large mass of waste that it can take a very long time for that to decompose completely. Now, if you're a trail crew or something like that, I think, we're now recommending that as long as you pick the spot carefully, and it's like way away from water and way away from campsites and things like that, that a group latrine probably does make sense because if you've got a group of, 15 people in the same place for say 2 weeks, you're going to just run out of places to do cat holes real fast. And it's going to look like some of our mega campsite areas. Um, it's not going to be pretty. And you're going to have people digging up cat holes to do new cat holes. And so, we basically say that that makes sense. Snow is really cold. You're out in the cold. You can carry that stuff out pretty easily. We have absolute sort of documentation where people went out cross-country skiing and stuff in the Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness. And where do they camp? Well, they don't really feel comfortable camping on the lake surface, even though it's frozen. They often camp on campsites that are out, kind of in the woods. And then if you defecate on the ground on campsites, when the snow melts out, you've got human waste sitting on your campsite. That's been documented and photographed. I've seen that. And so not a good idea. In snow, you can go out into the dense, bushes and do it perhaps, but be far, far away from the lake and be far, far away from the campsite and trails and things like that. Best, quite frankly, and quite easily done to just simply let it freeze and pack it out. It's not that hard to deal with. Analysis of paper products. This is kind of another one of my sort of pet areas of interest. And there's a very good study, which no one unfortunately has ever funded in the United States. It was done in Tasmania. And I looked very carefully at the environmental conditions of where they did this study, and they were quite diverse and quite varied. And they match up quite well in terms of rainfall and soil types to the US. And so I think that this is very applicable. It would be better to do the study in the US, but I think it's quite usable data. And so they went out and they buried toilet paper, facial tissues, and tampons. Now, there's no human waste involved in this study, just these products, okay? They buried these in 9 very different environments, and they were buried for 6, 12, and 24 months at depths of 2 and 6 inches. And what they found was that the toilet paper and tissues all decomposed in less than 2 or 3 years, in some cases as little as 1 year. But the tampons, which in many cases are made out of various polyesters and other weird compounds and fabrics, lasted 4 to 5 years. And the bottom line is that that's kind of excessive. Yeah, they eventually decompose, but that's kind of a long time. And so the Leave No Trace program basically says, stuff that's going to decompose like the human waste and the toilet paper fairly quickly, like in say 1 to 2 or 3 years, it's okay to bury that. But if it's going to be around a long, long time, then no, we should carry it out. And again, if you bury even toilet paper or human waste in the alpine zone or in a desert or in a wetland, it's going to be there more than 2 or 3 years, and which means you need to carry it out. And so well, we'll come back to that in a minute. So of 750 burials, 34, only 34 ever surfaced, and 30 of those had only been buried 2 inches deep. And so again, just under the organic litter kind of thing. And so as long as you dig a nice deep 4 to 6, 8 inch, really 6 to 8 inches are recommended, but if as long as you dig a nice deep cat hole and bury it deep, it's not going to come back up again. And I've also been, and I'm encouraging the entire Leave No Trace community to do this, is pick up a stick, there's always a stick nearby, and push your toilet paper to the bottom of the hole and just leave the stick down in there and then fill in your hole. And fill in and make it natural. And maybe put, what I usually do is put, just a leafy, not a leafy branch, but a dead branch on top so that, it looks like an unattractive place to maybe walk and perhaps to dig a cat hole. And so if you're out 200 feet away from stuff, the likelihood of someone digging in the exact same place within the next 3 years is pretty low, right? But pushing that toilet paper to the bottom of the hole, it's not that disgusting. It's fairly easily done. It takes a minute. And it ensures that that toilet paper won't make it back up to the surface of the ground. And then finally, I've said this several times, but pack out makes sense in certain places. Now, here's a study that I did literally in my yard. I have 5 acre property. I've got some woods. I went over into the woods. I dug lots of holes. I tried to replicate this same study in my on my yard. And here's what I found. The toilet paper in every case was gone. I live in Blacksburg, Virginia, in the mountains at about well, a little over 2,000 feet. Um, and all of the toilet paper is gone in 1 year, less than 1 year. I even pinned a bunch on the surface of the ground with a stake, like a tent peg, and just put just a few pieces of leaves on top of it. That was gone in less than a year. And then but I also use these new disposable wipes that everyone's using these days. And those took a full year, and you can see the middle picture, there's still some fibrous remains. Now, this was not antiseptic or disinfecting wipes. These were just soapy wipes that a lot of people are using these days. The metro people hate them because they don't, people flush them all the time, which you shouldn't do. And they get clogged up in the pumps that run sewage systems. And so the metro folks hate them. But more and more people are using them out of ground, out in backpacking situations. So I decided to try them. They do decompose pretty quickly, not as fast as toilet paper, but they do decompose. Now, anything that has disinfecting qualities is a different animal. But what I discovered was that all of the alcohol-based disinfecting ones, that alcohol probably just dissipates and goes away in less than a day. And then there are no antimicrobial properties left, and it decomposed completely. The only ones that didn't were these that were disinfecting by using sort of a chloride or a halide of some sort. Those are retained in the fabric and they continue to be antimicrobial to the point where they basically don't allow decomposition to occur, at least not very fast. So probably this one would have taken several years to go away completely. And I didn't test tampons. I just said those need to be backpacked out. Basically, if you use alcohol wipes and if you use these disposable wipes, those are probably fine to bury. Again, as long as you bury them deeply and you're 200 feet away from everything. And so that's what I discovered. I suggest, and I came up with protocols, and I've tried to get the Leave No Trace office to make these available and to encourage people in different agencies to try this out in their place. And in particular, I see that in places like Yosemite, they're saying pack out all of your used toilet paper and any other products you use, like the disposable wipes and disinfecting wipes and tampons. And I don't really feel like there's a justifiable basis for that because the water levels, the rainfall and climate of Yosemite was very, very, very similar to one of the places in Tasmania where this stuff all decomposed very quickly in less than 2 years. So I suggest to agencies and others that you do your own little study, citizen science, okay, and figure it out for yourself before we force visitors to do something which they find onerous, which is to carry out used toilet paper. It is onerous, and I know from a fact that there are a certain element of the population out there that when you tell them to do something that onerous, you run the risk of turning them off to the entire Leave No Trace program. That's not okay to turn them off to the entire Leave No Trace program. We have a lot of good protocols. We don't want to ruin it by telling them to do something that they really, really don't want to do. And so I don't know, that's kind of my position on that. Let's see, that's it. So now we're going to move on to principle 4, leave what you find. And we're going to focus initially here on non-native plants and invasives. This is an area of increasing concern among land managers. The introduction of these non-native plants, these are plants which were not originally native to the United States. They came from other countries, other continents. And they're now increasingly getting into some of our protected natural areas. And once they get in, they can disperse and spread, throughout those areas. And we've done some research on this. I have one good journal paper from the Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness. So the seeds can enter, they can be stuck to, boots or hooves of horses. They can be, stuck to the bottom of your tents, for example, if you're in suburbia and you have your kids using your tents for a sleepover and then you pack them away a little bit damp, the seeds from your lawn, will stick to the bottom of that tent. Next time you take your tent out, you're in the wilderness and the seeds unstick and then land on a campsite where they germinate and start growing. And once they're on a campsite, people can come in, put their tents up on that campsite, pick up those same seeds, and then move it to another campsite that could be 10 miles away. And so that's how they get spread from place to place camping. But also when you're hiking, you come into an area and you may have seeds stuck on your boots or on your clothing, which fall off along the trail. Or if you're using horses, the feed for horses that is carried into the wilderness might have weed seeds in it, and those can germinate. Or even seeds that are in the poop of horses ends up on the trail can germinate. They've done some research to document that some of those seeds will germinate from horse poop. So those are all issues that we're trying to prevent from leave no trace practices. Most of these non-native plants are disturbance associated, which means they only grow along trails and campsites that are sort of disturbed settings, generally where there's a fair amount of sun. A lot of them are shade intolerant. But there are a few species, a small number of species, which are truly invasive, which they can go and outcompete native vegetation in off-site areas. These are the ones that we're really concerned with. Yeah, I've just said that already. So let's move on. So you'll start seeing more and more of these signs that say, wipe your feet or try to take the seeds off of your clothing, off of your shoes, and off the bottoms of your boots in mud before you enter into a protected natural area. And so here's me doing sort of a 3-minute teachable moment to my venture crew. We're out going on a climbing trip, and we came across one of these signs, and I had one of the youth take a picture of me for this presentation. There have been some studies. Catherine Pickering, one of my colleagues from Australia, has done quite a few of these. Look up her papers. And here's just some statistics from some of the stuff that she cited. 228 species were identified from seeds that were taken off of people when they were, at the entrance to a protected natural area in Australia. And let's see, 94 of which 41% were species not native to Australia. So these are species that are truly sort of international. Um, okay, moving on. This is a photo showing Microstegium, still Japanese stilt grass. It's one of the worst invasives here in the East. There's quite a few of these species, but this particular one, I took this picture along the Appalachian Trail. You can see that it is associated very closely with the borders of the trail corridor. But in both the right and left sides, you can also see some patches that are moving out away from the trail, which means that this species can outcompete native vegetation or colonize deep shade, which is one of the few grasses that seems to be able to do that, which is very scary. The deer don't eat this. It has really no ecological value in those communities. So it's a big and growing concern. Another element of leave what you find is just simply leaving the things that you find when you're out there in the backcountry. And so flowers, for example, take a picture, make a sketch, but don't pick the flowers. Try to get your youth that are with you, the younger kids, to not pick the flowers. We're in that kind of a setting. The flowers, particularly for perennials, obviously, are created by seeds that come out of those flowers. You pick the flower, you've destroyed the seed production. That plant may not come back in future years, well, for annuals, but even perennials. And so a colleague of mine did a study way back, I think it was in the 80s or 90s, actually, in Great Smokies, where they found lots and lots of pink lady slippers and other orchids along the trails in Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Well, I'm sorry, they found these orchids and plants far away from trails, but not right along the trails. And so she did some transect studies and things and documented that anything close to and within sight of a trail was far, far less likely to have any orchids, any pretty flowers. like the pink lady slipper. And so people are absolutely picking these things and diminishing their presence along trails. Box turtles, interesting study I found when I was writing the Leave No Trace book. Lots of kids like to keep box turtles as pets. These turtles amazingly can live 120 years in the wild. There have been known incidences of turtles living that long outside of captivity. If they're captured and they're in a home setting and kids are taking care of them, their life expectancy is generally less than 1 year. And so you're literally killing an organism that was going to outlive you if you had left it in nature. That's kind of an extreme example, but box turtle is one of my favorite sort of wild animals. And so bottom line, it's best if we don't collect and keep these things as pets, which I, did when I was a kid. I think I did it well. I used to keep them for short periods of time, let them go where I found them. But quite frankly, if millions of people do that, it's rather dire for these native fauna that live out in the protected natural areas that we like to visit. Moving on to leave no trace principle number 5, minimize campfire impacts. Campfires are a challenge. Lots of youth in particular, really, having a campfire can be a very essential element of a very high quality experience. And so I think we need to be careful about taking away that privilege of having a campfire, for an outing, particularly for youth. And so if we need to regulate campfires, let's do it, but let's try to do it through education rather than regulation when possible. So let's see. Problems with campfires, there's quite a few actually. The campfire site can be large, filled with charcoal, can be filled with broken glass and trash and things like that. People go off in the woods, they cut down trees, in some cases live trees, which is kind of a head scratcher for me because live wood doesn't burn real well. And or dead trees that may be important cavity nesting habitat for, the woodpeckers make the holes, but flying squirrels and all kinds of other organisms use those cavities to nest. Even when they're on the ground, even when the tree has died and fallen down, those cavities can still be quite important to wildlife, as well as just all the beetles and things that are in that wood that are kind of the base of the food chain for bird populations, for example. Lots of insects that come out of those trees as they rot, are very important. And so, using leave no trace practices, we would essentially just pick up dead and down wood. We would never cut down a dead tree or a live tree. Okay. And then finally, campfires can, produce long-term changes in soil, physical and chemical properties. When you burn a campfire, you're essentially sterilizing the soil underneath that campfire. So if we're going to have campfires, we need to isolate and have them in just one spot, one permanent spot on campsites. And unfortunately, that means putting in an anchored steel fire grate is probably our best practice if we're going to allow campfires. Now, in wilderness, obviously not, although they have done that in the Boundary Water Canary Wilderness. But in most wilderness areas, a simple rock structure, and if you can anchor those rocks, like embed some of them, larger ones, in the ground to permanently identify the place, the one place on campsites to have a campfire that can work. But generally, the leave no trace guidance is don't have a campfire unless you really need one. And so use a stove for cooking, use candle lantern for light. I've done that with my venture crew, and it's quite effective. Just having a candle lantern, kind of that you sit around is not that dissimilar from a campfire. Only build one when it's permissible, when the threat of wildfires is very low. Build it small, keep it small. Build it for a fairly short period of time, like a couple of hours. You don't need to be burning a campfire all day long. Scout troops have real problems with that with youth, but convince the youth that they just need a campfire to socialize around in the evening hours, maybe for a couple hours. And most importantly, use dead and down wood that you can break by hand. You don't need to carry an axe or a saw on any of these trips for campfires. I mean, maybe to clear trails and things, you need that stuff, but not for campfires. Leave the woods tools at home. You can't really do a whole lot of damage to trees, live or dead, if you don't have a woods tool, an axe or a saw or a hatchet. And so that's probably the biggest leave no trace message. And you know, we've done studies that show some really severe impacts from from felling trees, basically. In this boundary water canoe area wilderness study that I'm showing you here, this upper left picture that's in black and white shows the campsite that I measured during my doctoral program at University of Minnesota in 1982, and you can see all the trees. The picture in the middle of your screen, 2014 picture, is color, and it shows none of those trees virtually. It shows one. And that rock with the red arrow is the exact same rock. That's kind of how you tie these two photos together. And so all of these trees essentially have been cut down, mostly by visitors. Occasionally there'll be a dead tree on a campsite and the agency will come in and cut it flush to the ground. But in most cases, these trees that we see people cutting down are, live, reasonably healthy trees, and they just cut them down for firewood. It's amazing. They go off-site as well. The picture in the top middle is looking off-site in 2014 when we were replicating my doctoral study in that year. And we found something like an average of 15 or 17, I think it was, cut tree stumps on every campsite that we studied. It was amazing that people, and these are live trees that were mostly live trees that you're seeing here, that people are cutting down and burning up in firewood. And then in the upper right, you see a paper birch tree that people have cut, and stripped the bark off of. It's a good fire starter. And yet we find dead paper birch all over the place, just off site, on the ground. And you can strip that stuff off and bring it over and use it for fire starter if you need that. So at any rate, here's some of the statistics from that study, the Boundary Water Canoe Area study of campsite and trees. 17.8 stumps per site was the mean number of tree stumps, which that's just astounding. And to me, again, that's completely avoidable impact. And this is absolutely something that Leave No Trace can and should address. And quite frankly, the easiest thing you can do is just never bring any woods tool on any camping trip. And groups like the Boy Scouts simply need to disassociate woods tool use from camping. If they want to teach the safe, ethical use of woods tools to future homeowners who need to trim the trees or cut trees down on their property, they can do it when they're doing a trail maintenance, conservation, or stewardship project. They don't need to do that in the context of camping. And so that's another soapbox issue for me, is that, we really need to leave these woods tools at home. Moving on to principle 6, close. We only got 7, so we're close to the end. Respect wildlife. We've talked about wildlife a number of different times, but bottom line, we are visitors to their homes, to their habitat, to the place where they live. And as visitors, we should behave like visitors. We should be aware of the wildlife's needs and not interfere with those needs. We want to keep them wild. We don't want to attract them by giving them food or allowing them to access our food, whether it's intentional or not. We're turning wild animals into kind of, food attracted nuisances. And, in this case, the lower picture on the left, this is a Hawaiian girl in Haleakala National Park, and she's literally feeding the rare and endangered, federally listed Nene geese in the park. And I managed to get a picture to include in shows like this. But she had food in her hand and she was feeding them, and it looks like they're food attracted. And they're not natural. They're not, eating the natural food pyramid foods that these geese are supposed to be eating. Cheetos and potato chips and things like that. They're not in the food pyramid for wildlife, and so we shouldn't be introducing those foods into their into their food regime. And so they will suffer nutritionally. In the Grand Canyon National Park, for example, they had a number of deer that were becoming almost violently food attracted. Like they were, coming into campsites and occasionally kicking people and stuff and being really obnoxious nuisance animals. And yet they also sort of look sickly, a number of them. And so the park, essentially killed a small number of them, less than 10, I think it was, sent them off to a veterinarian who opened them up, and they found as much as 3 to 5 pounds of garbage, either plastic or aluminum foil and stuff, that was literally caught in their intestines. In other words, they couldn't pass this stuff out like a bear can pass it out. You've probably seen bear poop with, freeze-dried food, aluminum packets in their bear poop, but deer can't do this. And some other animals can't either. And so these things were eating the food, but you leave a bag of potato chips or a loaf of bread or something on a picnic table, even in the backcountry, and like in Great Grand Canyon. And then the deer come in and eat that stuff, and they can't open the packaging. They pretty much eat all of it, the packaging and the food, and then this packaging gets stuck in them. So these deer were essentially painfully food attracted, suffering nutritionally and whatnot. They ended up killing quite a few more that were like this and found, again, lots of trash stuck in their intestines. And they started a massive educational program that was pretty effective, from what I understand. So again, a perfect leaving a trace topic. Again, displacement of animals. Animals go where they need to go. And so if we're moving animals away from where they are, then we're moving them by definition from preferred sort of primary habitat to less preferred sort of secondary or tertiary habitat where their needs are not being met as well. And so anytime we're moving animals around because of our presence, that we've exceeded their flight distance and they run away or fly away, that's a bad thing. One or two people do it a day, no big deal. Thousands of people do it every day, like in Yellowstone National Park, it's a really big deal. And so these animals are being either temporarily, in time, or spatially in space, displaced from places where they really want to be. Now, it can be challenging. If you have a great blue heron, the GBH, and you're canoeing down a river, you can try to go to the other side, and hug the banks, but sometimes these birds will still fly. And so there, sometimes you can't do much about it. Other times you can. You can give them the space. If you're watching wildlife, carry binoculars and use a telephoto lens, but give them as much space as you possibly can. Everyone loves to observe wildlife when they're out in the outdoors, but we do need to be paying close attention to the wildlife and trying to protect their space so that they aren't constantly flying around or running away from us. Finally, the seventh principle, be considerate of other visitors, is another one that we added back in the late 90s. And this is one of my favorite pictures of all. I have one of my venture crew girls in this photo after she left my crew in high school and went off to college. She went to UVA, University of Virginia, and she's the girl in the yellow in the foreground here. And she posted this quite naively to Facebook, and I was a Facebook friend of hers, and I saw it. And what do you think that I said when I saw this picture? So one of the practices in Be Considerate of Other Visitors, that if you're going to take a break when you're hiking, move off the trail. And so if someone says, I'm tired, I've got to deal with a blister or something like that, and we're hiking along, we say, okay, well, the next good place we can find, we'll move off the trail and take a break, and you can deal with your blister. You don't want to go too far, but clearly these folks didn't go far enough. They're literally taking a break. So if another group came along, they have to kind of traipse and trip over people and packs and things like that as they get past this. And so I gave this young woman a pretty hard time. And she said, I wasn't in charge of the trip. But I said, I don't care. You can still say something. This is really not a good place. It's a perfect teachable moment. It's not a good place to take a break. Let's hike a little bit further and look for a place where we can get off the trail. Again, this sort of reinforces what I was saying earlier about side hill trails, is that, there's no flat terrain around here. So they're going to have to hike another 5 minutes to get to a place where they can go off trail. Um, Group size is another big question, particularly for the organized youth groups like the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or other groups. And interestingly, studies have found that, two-thirds of wilderness visitors report that seeing large groups does indeed reduce their feeling of solitude and being in wilderness. However, and this is kind of important, group size is one of the most low-ranked problems in comparison to other kinds of, issues. And so, in other words, group size is kind of not good to have big groups in the wilderness. But quite frankly, it's not a big important problem for people. Noise, for example, might be a bigger problem. Um, and so less than 50% reported that seeing large groups was a problem, for example. And so what research really does find here is that a group's actual behavior, are you at a wilderness lake basin and you're shooting a gun at 9 o'clock at night, which I experienced on the other side of that lake. Are they shooting at us or towards us? Do they know that we're even here? We don't have a campfire. Do we need to go dash behind a tree or a rock to escape bullets? It completely destroyed my wilderness experience. And I was in wilderness when that happened. It was, back when I was in college. And so your actual behavior is way more important than sort of just the group size that you're with. And large groups, if they're camping, particularly if they're doing dispersed, natural site camping, like my particular venture crew does frequently, you're not even close to other people. You're not within earshot or visual range of other people. But if we pick campsites, even established campsites carefully, we can do the same thing. We can avoid camping. In other words, if you're hiking in to find a campsite and there's a group already on one campsite and you're looking at one that's just, 50 feet away, keep looking. Look for another one that's like 400 feet away, or more. So those sorts of things. Large groups can cause excessive impacts if they don't find a sufficiently large campsite. This is a really important issue. So if you have a group and your group needs 6 tent pads, to be comfortable that night, don't pick and use a campsite that only has 3 decent tent pads. Someone's going to have to be pioneering a new tent spot, and that may mean making the campsite a lot bigger. And so if that's the case, then pick 2 different campsites and separate your group, and camp on 2 different campsites, hopefully somewhat close together. But at any rate, that's a really important issue for large youth groups. And it's a frequent problem because otherwise you're going to substantially enlarge a campsite in just one night because several people have to go create new tent pads. So if you got a big group, you've got to stay on large campsites that have enough tent pads or split your group into 2. That's probably the most important. Large groups with horses have more potential to cause greater impact. That's been documented in a number of different studies. And so limits on group size for horse users are sort of more sort of appropriate or necessary than for hikers. Hikers can do some things, but horse groups, if you're a large horse group and you got 15, 20 horses, that substantially limits where you can camp with low impact. Okay, so we've talked, just to summarize, breaking your large group into smaller groups to hike and camp separately is generally a good thing. Make sure that if you're hiking separately, that you end up at the same place at the end of the night. So if my rule with my venture group is that when you get to a trail intersection, you stop and you wait until everyone shows up, and then you go beyond the trail intersection as a group, because otherwise you could go 2 different ways and get hopelessly separated. Confining your activity to already impacted areas. Do not enlarge any campsite. Meeting infrequently as a large group and only on durable surfaces. If you got a big, huge bedrock area, go for it. You could have a large group together in one place for maybe some training or something like that, which is what we did. But, again, pick a place that's not within sight or sound of other groups. Practicing quiet and courteous behavior. And so if it's at night and your group is a little bit raucous, again, good reason to camp way far away from other groups. But if you are close to other groups and it's unavoidable, then you've got to enforce quiet hours with your group. So at any rate, that's it. That's kind of my take on sort of the science behind the leave no trace practices. In some cases, there's lots of applicability. In other cases, not so much. And of course, I didn't have near enough time, even though I went over here, to talk about all of the various practices that are important. And so, by all means, spend some time. If you can get the official Leave No Trace book and read that, there's a lot more information in there about problems and solutions and educational sort of low impact practices that you can learn and pass on to other individuals. And that's quite frankly the only way it's going to happen is that if all of us learn this stuff well and then we all share it with as many people as we possibly can, either in a professional role as someone who's out there, in visitor centers or on the trail, taking care of these protected natural areas that we all love, or just on your own trips, with friends and family, sharing these principles and practices with them. And quite frankly, you don't have to do it in the name of Leave No Trace. You can just say, here's how you wash your dishes. And that's kind of what I often do. Use teachable moments is one of my favorite practices as you get to the campsite and say, gee, where should we put our tents? Oh, gee, well, let me talk for just a few minutes about safe, low impact places to set up your tent on this campsite. And I bring the younger, youth around to me and we go off and look at, is this a good place? Is this a good place? And it's, just teachable moments is kind of, quite frankly, the best way, or at least the way I've found to be most effective for communicating leave no trace practices. So to end, just say happy trails and remember to leave no trace on all of your trips and enjoy the outdoors, but don't love them to death. Thanks. It's been my pleasure to talk to you today. By all means, contact me if I can be of any service to you or give a presentation or whatever. As I said, I'm retired now. I've got more time. Email me. It's jmarion@vt.edu. Take care. Bye.